Hey, everybody. Thank you for being here. This is week 3 of the Big Book Study. We're getting into Bill's story. Eric does a phenomenal job at breaking down Bill's story. Now we're going to cover half this week and then the other half next week. And it's packed full of great content. But again, thank you for being here and enjoy week 3.
All right. Anybody joining us, welcome to the Real Recovery Big Book Study. And then anybody who has been here before, welcome back. Let's open this with a moment of silence followed by the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. So last week we went over the doctor's opinion the past 2 weeks, and we learned about the allergy and the obsession that I have to alcohol. We learned that if I cannot take a drink without getting drunk, but I cannot not take a drink because I have an obsession of the mind that compels me to drink. So if I can't take a drink without getting drunk, but I can't not take a drink, then I'm powerless over alcohol. Bill W. figured this out via Dr. Silkworth, who told him about this while he was a patient at Towns Hospital. We've gone over this, and he implemented the program, and after the fellowship grew to about 100 people, they decided to write this book. And there were 60, there's been some debate, 60, 80 of the first 100 members of Alcoholics Anonymous were involved in writing this book. Bill W. authored it, but they edited it. And this was their 12th step to the world. And they understood that they would not be able to sit down with people all over the country and tell their story. Bill wouldn't be able to sit down with them individually, tell his story, but he also understood that it was one alcoholic to another alcoholic speaking alcoholic that held the depth and the weight. They weren't going to listen to somebody who wasn't an alcoholic. So understanding that, they said, well, Bill needs to put his story in this book. And at the end of the book, there's multiple stories that are edited and taken out, removed, and added through the different editions. We're on the 4th edition of this book. So this is Bill's story that we're about to read. And, what you're going to see is you're going to see the progression of the disease completely. And the way this disease progresses for every story in this book, for Bill W., myself, every man I've sponsored, it starts off, it's fun. That's why we do it. I have heard thousands of testimonies from men and women. I have yet to hear one of them say, yeah, I started drinking at 15 and I hated it from day one. I haven't heard that. I don't think I ever will. Starts off, it's fun. But given enough time, it eventually progresses to the point where it tells everyone to go away. Just go away. Leave me alone. I don't want to hear it. And I tell them to go away for so long, eventually they go away. And then given enough time, eventually it tells me to go away. Just get it over with. You're no good. And you're going to see that progression exactly in here, in Bill's story. Not only are you going to see that progression, but you're also going to see this program, the spiritual program of action, laid out completely in Bill's story. I always tell people to understand this. If I'm an alcoholic, I have to learn how to. I couldn't identify with Bill because he was an older guy. He was a stockbroker. He was written in 1939. It was very hard for me to identify with him. But I was told to identify with the way he thought, felt, and drank. If I could identify with the way Bill thought, felt, and drank, then I'm going to have hope from his story. And I'm going to see that he's an alcoholic like me and that he got better. And the reason why that's so important, and you'll see it in here when Ebby Thatcher comes to visit Bill, is I have to understand that he drank the way I did, or I'm just not going to listen to him. And so we're going to get started here with Bill's story. And I want you to try to identify with how he thought, felt, and drank. And it's on page 1. War fever ran high in the New England town to which we knew young officers from Plattsburgh were assigned, and we were flattered when the first citizens took us into their homes, making us feel heroic. He's talking about Plattsburgh, New York, where his battalion was stationed. He was in the National Guard. And we were flattered when the first citizens took us to their home, making us feel heroic. Here was love, applause, war, moments sublime, with intervals hilarious. And one thing I've learned about Bill W. is he liked to tell tall tales, which means he wasn't not lying, but exaggerating. And I've read and watched plenty of things, him speaking. There's something that I read one time where, and it's well documented, where Lois would say to him, who had said, if the convention, he'd say there were 5,000 people at the convention, but there were really 3,000. And Bill knew that he did this, and he jokingly would wink at her and tell her, hey, you're ruining it. But he knew that he exaggerated things, and he did the same thing in here. And you're going to see and I'm telling you this because it's important to understand his humanity. He was just like me. And in here, you're going to see he was driven by success, but he had a huge ego. Bill W. had a tremendous ego. I mean, he wrote a book called As Bill Sees It, right? And you're going to see in here that he cared as much about what people thought of him as he did anything else. And he never actually saw combat. Bill W. never actually saw combat, but you're going to see here where he makes it out as if he did. He was stationed in England, and he never went on from England. The war ended. He was never in combat. But he kind of gives the impression here that he was. Here was love, applause, war, moments sublime, with intervals hilarious. I was part of life at last. And in the midst of the excitement, I discovered liquor. I forgot the strong warnings and the prejudices of my people concerning drink. In time, we sailed for over there. I was very lonely and again turned to alcohol. I can relate to that. We landed in England, and I visited Winchester Cathedral. Much moved, I wandered outside. My attention was caught by a doggerel on an old tombstone, and a doggerel is just a rustic poem. Here lies a Hampshire grenadier who caught his death drinking cold small beer. A good soldier is ne'er forgot, whether he dieth by musket or by pot. And he's not talking about weed. He's talking about a pot of beer. That's how they drank beer in England at the time. They called it a pot. Ominous warning, which I failed to heed. 22 and a veteran of foreign wars. Here's the little bit of embellishment, right? And a veteran of foreign wars, I went home at last. I fancied myself a leader, for had not the men of my battery given me a special token of appreciation, and that token was a gold pocket watch that they had given him as their appreciation for being their leader. I imagined my talent for leadership, I imagined, would place me at the head of vast enterprises which I would manage with the utmost assurance. I took a night law course and obtained employment as an investigator for a surety company. The drive for success was on. I'd prove to the world I was important. And there it is. My work took me about Wall Street, and little by little I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, but some became very rich. Why not I? I studied economics and business as well as law. Potential alcoholic that I was, I nearly failed my law course. At one of my finals, I was too drunk to think or write. Though my drinking was not yet continuous, it disturbed my wife. We had long talks when I would still her forebodings by telling her that men of genius conceived their best projects when drunk, that the most majestic construction of philosophical thought were so derived. And there he can't see the truth from the false there. He's giving her a load. By the time I had completed the course, I knew the law was not for me. The inviting maelstrom of Wall Street had me in its grip, and a maelstrom is like a tornado. Business and financial leaders were my heroes. Out of this alloy of drink and speculation, I commenced to forge the weapon that one day would turn in its flight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons. Living modestly, my wife and I saved $1,000. And now $1,000 at the time, around the 1920s, had the purchasing power of about $15,000 today. So that's a little savings that he put together, right? It went into certain securities, then cheap and rather unpopular. I rightly imagined that they would someday have a great rise. I failed to persuade my broker friends to send me out looking over factories and managements, but my wife and I had decided to go anyway. I had developed a theory that most people lost money in stocks through ignorance of markets. I discovered many more reasons later on. So you could say that Bill W. became one of the first investment counselors. He had this theory that, hey, at this time, they were making money hand over fist on the stock market, and it was literally just gambling. It was all speculation. They didn't know anything about the companies they were investing in. And Bill W. goes to them and says, hey, I've got this idea. Right now, we're just blindly putting money into these companies. Let me go and take a look at them and and give you reports on them, and we can start investing with a little bit of knowledge. And they refused. They're like, no, we don't really need that. We're making as much money as we can handle. We don't need you to do that. And so they just rejected the idea completely. But the drive that Bill W. had, Bill W. he was just a go-getter. And his drive, you're going to hear here, we gave up our positions and off we roared on a motorcycle, the sidecar stuffed with tent, blankets, a change of clothes, and 3 huge volumes of a financial reference service. So Bill W. says, hey, I don't need you guys. I'm going to go do this myself. And he gets on a motorcycle with his wife and a tent. They're going up and down the eastern seaboard, sleeping in a tent. That's dedication. That's drive, right? Our friends thought a lunacy commission should be appointed. Perhaps they were right. I had some success at speculation, so we had a little money, but we once worked on a farm for a month to avoid drawing on our small capital. That was the last honest manual labor on my part for many a day. We covered the whole eastern United States in a year. At the end of it, my reports to Wall Street procured me a position there and the use of a large expense account. The exercise of an option brought in more money, leaving with us with a profit of several $1,000s for that year. Several's around 3 to 5, right? So several $1,000s. You're talking at that time in the early 1920s, you're talking about $47,000 to $78,000 right around there. That's median income today. So here's Bill W., never had anything in his life, and now he's got a good little start after this thing. And here it comes. For the next few years, fortune threw money and applause my way. He's got to add the applause in there. You're going to see it throughout his story, how much he cared about image and what people thought. And I think that's kind of a common thing with us alcoholics, at least for me. And here he goes. Through money and fortune or money and applause my way, I had arrived. My judgment and ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper millions. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. Drink was taking an important and exhilarating part in my life. There was loud talk in the jazz places uptown. Everyone spent in thousands and chattered in millions. Scoffers could scoff and be damned. I made a host of fair-weather friends. So here's Bill W., the roaring 20s, right? I remember studying about this in high school, the flapper girls and the jazz clubs, and it was a one big party. And here's Bill W. right in the middle of it, and people are making millions off of his idea. Bill W. became an absolute rock star before rock and roll was ever around. He was the man. People wanted to be around him. They wanted to go out to the clubs with him. This was the life he was living. He had it all. And it just built on the ego and his desire to look at me and it all went with his alcoholism. So I made a host of fair weather friends. My drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing all day and almost every night. The remonstrances of my friends terminated in a row, and I became a lone wolf. And remonstrances are the strong warnings. It's people saying, hey, Bill, you've got to stop drinking. Why don't you slow down? Why don't you quit? Those are the remonstrances. And when people stop telling you that, when my friends stop saying, they just stopped telling me that. Well, I should have known then I had a problem. But here you can see it. He becomes a lone wolf. So it starts off, he's having such a good time. He's having so much fun. And now here you're going to start to see where people just start to go away from him. There had been there were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real infidelity. For loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes. I believe most everything in this book, but right here I think that maybe Bill W.'s nose is growing and his pants are on fire. There'd been no real infidelity. He was a rock star man at the time. Women were throwing themselves at him, and he knows Lois is going to read this book. This is my opinion. But I just couldn't imagine that today looking at and say, well, honey, it wasn't real infidelity. So this just kind of makes me laugh right here. In 1929, I contracted Gulf fever. We went at once to the country, my wife to applaud, while I started out to overtake Walter Hagen. Liquor caught up with me much faster than I came up behind Walter. I began to be jittery in the morning. Golf permitted drinking every day and every night. It was fun to caroom around the exclusive course which had inspired such awe in me as a lad. I inquired the impeccable coat of tan one sees on the well-to-do. The local banker watched me whirl fat checks in and out of his till with amused skepticism. Abruptly, in October 1929, hell broke loose on the New York Stock Exchange. After one of those days of inferno, I wobbled from a hotel bar to a brokerage office. It was 8 o'clock, 5 hours after the market closed. The ticker still clattered. I was staring at an inch of tape which bore the inscription XYZ-32. It had been 52 that morning. I was finished, and so were many friends. The papers reported men jumping to death from the towers of high finance. That disgusted me. I would not jump. I went back to the bar. Here's Bill's solution. So, and I remember reading about this in history, and people jumping from the like he says, the towers of high finance, committing suicide on this dark day of the stock market crash. And his solution is to go back to the bar. My friends had dropped several million since 10 o'clock. So what? Tomorrow was another day. As I drank, the old fierce determination to win came back. And man, I can relate to that. That was me at the bar getting drunk with my friends. Say, yeah, we're going to stop drinking tomorrow. We're going to start a company. We're going to start a company together, or we're going to start working out, or all these grand plans that I would put together. It's coming out of jail or the divorce court or whatever. And I'll show them I'm going to get this back. And I get that drive to succeed again as soon as I start drinking. Next morning, I telephoned a friend in Montreal. He had plenty of money left and thought I had better go to Canada. By the following spring, we were living in our accustomed style. I felt like Napoleon returning from St. Elba, or from Elba, no St. Helena for me. So he's talking about when Napoleon returned and was cast away to the island of St. Helena, and that's not going to happen to him. And again, it's kind of like what he looked like when he's coming back. But drinking caught up with me again, and my generous friend had to let me go. This time we stayed broke. So once again, this guy has to let him go. So you see, his friends are starting to leave him. He's becoming a lone wolf. His disease is now telling everyone, go away. We went to live with my wife's parents. I found a job, then lost it as a result of a brawl with a taxi driver. I'm going to assume he was drunk. Not many people get into a brawl with a taxi driver if they're not. Mercifully, no one could guess that I was to have no real employment for 5 years or hardly draw a sober breath. My wife began to work in a department store, coming home exhausted to find me drunk. So here's Bill W., the high roller, the guy carooming around on the golf course, the bankers watching him with amused skepticism as he whirls fat checks through their till. And now here he is, drinking, sleeping on the couch. Wife's working in a department store. He's fallen pretty far here. I became an unwelcome hanger-on at the brokerage places. And I can relate to that. I can relate going to the gym that I used to go to all the time, people not really wanting me there, but they didn't want to tell me that. And this is Bill W. now. He's going to these places where he used to frequent the brokerages, and they're like, Bill, we don't want you here. You're embarrassing us. You smell like alcohol. I can picture this in my head, and I can relate to that. Liquor ceased to be a luxury. It became a necessity. So now it went from fun, he's having a good time, to controlling. Bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, and often 3, got to be routine. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I would pay my bills at the bars and the delicatessen. So again, he's gone from being high-rolling Bill, this at the top of the food chain, everything all the time, down to the $20 guy. Hey, can you loan me $20? Hey, can you start me a tab? I'll pay you on Friday. He's this guy. Sometimes small, so this went on endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. So now Bill's starting to have physical consequences. It's no longer fun. Now he's drinking out of necessity, and here come the physical consequences. This went on endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. A tumbler full of gin, followed by a half a dozen bottles of beer, would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation, and there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. That is absolutely insane and delusional. We talk about self-deception, right? And that's the obsession. My mind thinks I can still control this. And self-deception can't spot self-deception. If I'm deceiving myself, I have absolutely no way of knowing that. And here Bill's completely deceiving himself. He's gone from being Bill, the guy that people are making millions off of his ideas and and he's the high roller, to this guy here who's drinking to steady his nerves, sleeping on the couch. Nobody wants him around, but yet he still thinks he can control the situation. That is the perfect example of the obsession. All these consequences. He's got a list of consequences now that he's living in this wreckage, but yet he still thinks he can control the situation. And there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. Gradually, things got worse. The house was taken over by the mortgage holder. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. Then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at the low point of 1932, and I had somehow formed a group to buy. I was to share generously in the profits. So he's put together, these guys came to him and they said, hey, listen, Bill, we've got this deal going on, and you're the only guy we can think of that can close this, but you've got to stop drinking. You've got to pull yourself together. And Bill says, I can do it. I'm going to do it. And this deal would have gotten his life right back on track. He'd have been fine. He'd have crawled out of this. And he stayed sober for a little bit, putting this deal together. And the story says that he relapsed on Applejack gin or whiskey or something like that. But he so he has this period of sobriety. This deal is going to pull him out of this. And then he goes on a prodigious bender, and prodigious means incredible, awe-inspiring, extreme. He goes on this prodigious bender, and the chance vanished. And Dr. Silkworth talked about this. If you go back to page XXIX in the doctor's opinion right here, XXIX, he says, I've had many men who had, for example, worked a period of months on some problem or business deal which was to be settled on a certain date favorably to them. That's exactly what Bill W. is doing. He gets this opportunity to get his life back on track. He gets sober. He works on this deal. It's to be settled on a certain date favorably to them. They took a drink a day or so prior to the date, and then the phenomenon of craving at once became paramount to all other interests, so that the important appointment was not met. That's exactly what happens to Bill W. here. The prodigious bender, and that chance vanished. I woke up. This had to be stopped. I saw I could not take so much as one drink. So for the first time, he sees the truth here about himself. For the first time, he sees now, I'm finished. I can't take one more drink. I was through forever, but then I was through for it. Before then, I had written lots of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business, and so I did, because now he means it, just like I did so many times. And he gets his wife on board. I talked before about holding people hostage in my life, and this is an example of that. Now he gets her on board. This time he means business. And so I did. So this is the first time he goes on the bender. Here's the second time. Shortly afterwards, I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way. I had taken it. Was I crazy? Because see, now Bill understands what's been happening to him. He said it before here. He said, I saw I cannot take so much as one drink, but then he winds up drunk again, right? And he says, where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way. I'd taken it. Was I crazy? I began to wonder, for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that, right? So what he does here, the first time when he wakes up and he says, I can't do this anymore. I know I can't do this. He brings out his willpower, and he's going to stay sober on willpower, right? But shortly afterwards, he comes home drunk. Willpower doesn't work against an obsession of the mind. In a battle of willpower versus an obsession of the mind, the obsession of the mind wins out every single time. Willpower only shows up when you think what you're doing is wrong. But if I have a mind that tells me, no, it's okay, here's how. There's absolutely no need for me to have willpower. It's non-existent. It's not there. So when my mind tricks me into thinking it's okay, and only makes me think about how alcohol is going to make me feel and not what it's going to do to me, my willpower doesn't show up. Renewing my resolve, I tried again. Some time passed, and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. I could laugh at the gin mills. Now I had what it takes. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. In no time, I was beating on the bar, asking myself how it happened. As the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I would manage better the next time, but I might as well get good and drunk then, and I did. The remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. The courage to do battle was not there. And if we go back to the doctor's opinion, what I just read, when it says on XXIX at the bottom, or at the top here, it says, after they succumb to desire again, as so many do, and the phenomenon of craving develops, they pass through the well-known stages of a spree, emerging remorseful with a firm resolution not to drink again. And this is repeated over and over and over. And that's why I numbered those, what I just did about all these times that Bill W. said, I'm finished. I could see that I could never take a drink again, but yet here he goes again and again and again. And the next morning he emerges, and he says it here, the remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable, and I can absolutely relate to that feeling. Me waking up in the morning after swearing I would never do this again. And I couldn't think of any better words to use than remorse, horror, because that's what it was for me. My life became a horror show, and hopelessness. And the courage to do battle was no longer there. My brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. I hardly dared cross the street lest I collapse and be run down by an early morning truck, for it was scarcely daylight. An all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. My writhing nerves were stilled at last. A morning paper told me the market had gone to hell again. Well, so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. That was a hard thought. Should I kill myself? And here we are. It started off, it was fun. And it progressed to the point where it told everyone to go away. And now Bill W.'s disease is telling him to go away. His alcoholism is telling him to go away. Go kill yourself. And then he goes on, he says, no, not now. Then a mental fog settled down. Gin would fix that. So 2 bottles and oblivion. And now here we find Bill W. drinking for the sickest reason of all, complete oblivion. To run absolutely as far and deep away from himself as he can. The mind and body are marvelous mechanisms, for mine endured this agony 2 more years. Sometimes I stole from my wife's slender purse when the morning terror and madness were on me. Again, I swayed dizzily before an open window or the medicine cabinet where there was poison, cursing myself for a weakling, again wanting to kill himself. There were flights from the city to country and back as my wife and I sought escape. Then came the night when the physical and mental torture was so hellish, I feared I would burst through my window sash and all, and throw himself from the window and kill himself. Somehow I managed to drag my mattress to a lower floor lest I leap. A doctor came with a heavy sedative. The next day found me drinking both gin and sedative. This combination soon landed me on the rocks. People feared for my insanity, and so did I. I could eat little or nothing when drinking, and I was 40 pounds underweight. He's killing himself with malnutrition. And I can relate to that. My brother-in-law is a physician, and through his kindness and that of my mother, I was placed in a nationally known hospital for the mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics, and this is where he finds himself with Dr. Silkworth, which we read about in the doctor's opinion, under the so-called belladonna treatment, which was a plant, and it was a way that it was like a comfort medication at the time. My belladonna treatment, my brain cleared. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise helped much. Best of all, I met a kind doctor who explained that though certainly selfish and foolish, I had been seriously ill, bodily and mentally. And this is where, in the doctor's opinion, we read, Dr. Silkworth is now telling him, explaining to him what is wrong with him, what alcoholism is, or what he thinks it is at the time. It relieved me somewhat to learn that in alcoholics, the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor, though it often remains strong in other respects. My incredible behavior in the face of a desperate desire to stop was explained. So Bill W. wanted to stop just like I did. Where I told you could have given me a lie detector test. I promised, I want to stop. I want with everything I have to stop, but I couldn't. I can't stop. I remember going to the psych ward and or in the hospital and the nurse saying to me, you just have to stop drinking. I know that. I can't. I want to with everything I have, but I can't. So his incredible behavior in the face of a desperate desire to stop was explained. Understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hope. For 3 or 4 months, the goose hung high. He was doing well. He was staying sober. I went to town regularly, even made a little money. Surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. So Dr. Silkworth lets him go. He goes out, but there's no AA to go to. There's nothing. It's just, hey, this is what's wrong with you. Good luck. But it was not, for the frightful day came when I drank once more. The curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. After a time, I returned to the hospital. This was the finish, the curtains, it seemed to me. My weary and despairing wife was informed that it would all end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I would develop a wet brain, perhaps within a year. She would soon have to give me over to the undertaker of the asylum. They did not need to tell me. I knew and almost welcomed the idea. It was a devastating blow to my pride. Once again, there's that pride and ego, right? I, who had thought so well of myself and my abilities, of my capacity to surmount my obstacles, was cornered at last. Now I was to plunge into the dark, joining that endless procession of sots who had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What would I not give to make amends? But that was over now. No words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. He's given up. And I can relate to that. I can relate to exactly the way he describes that bitter morass of self-pity, which is about the sickest that an alcoholic can get, is living in that self-pity. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. It can do that for a bit. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink, and on Armistice Day, 1934, I was off again. So all this, the bitter morass of self-pity, the quicksand surrounding him, the doctor telling him, you're gonna die. You're gonna get wet brain. You're gonna have to be given over to the asylum. Fear sobered him for a bit. And then he picks up the drink again. I was off again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. I read that with sponsees, and I'm reading that with you right now, and I cannot help but have this emotional reaction every time I read that. Because that was me. I was a homeless alcoholic living in a homeless park. There was absolutely zero hope. But I was soon to be catapulted into a life and a fourth dimension and that I could not ever have dreamed of. And it's hard for people to understand that. A lot of people won't believe that. I didn't believe it when I came in. That's not possible. But I have an emotional reaction every time I read that because that is available to everyone. It is not hit or miss. We're going to end right there because next week, Bill's going to start telling us about what happened to him and the solution. That's what I got. Thank you.